Welcome to the video tutorial on custom drop shadows. As you can see with this photo here, it looks as if the corners of the photo are popping up off the page like they've been crinkled up off the page. And that is what we're going to be learning to do in this tutorial, and I think it's pretty cool. I kind of like doing it in my layouts. And ever since I first wrote this tutorial, I seem to do it more and more. So I'm going to go ahead and get my original photo. You can see now that it's not popping off the page at all. Press Ctrl J, so I have a copy of it to work with. I have here my written tutorial, which I wrote quite some time ago, but I'm going to try to follow it so that I don't forget anything. So we'll be popping in and looking at where I'm at with this every once in a while. You see here it says, for this technique it is easier to add a border or a stroke to the photo before making the custom shadow. This is because the custom shadow is on its own layer underneath the photo, and should you add the border afterwards, it's going to cover up some of that shadow. It's not that you can't go and make the shadow layer a little bit larger and fix it. It's just easier to go ahead and make sure you have that border on before you make your shadow layer, and that's just something to keep in mind. We're going to talk about the zero distance drop shadow, and that's just kind of what I call it. Let's go back in here to Photoshop Elements and just apply a simple drop shadow, and I'm going to go back to this layer so we don't have that bounding box around, so you can see. And if you're familiar with the basic shadows, because of the direction of the light, this shadow is only on the right hand side and the left hand side of this photo, because the sunlight is coming from up here. However, sometimes I want that drop shadow to go on all four sides. And I remember when I first started digital scrapbooking and I picked up this little tip, I was like, wow, I love that. And so let's take a look at this. If you click on the FX to bring up the style settings, if you take the size of the drop shadow, and I think it's the distance, maybe, let's go with the distance, and drop it all the way down, you're going to see now that that drop shadow is on all four sides. Did you see that happen? I want you to look out here as I move it, and there it is. I've increased it and it's only on the two sides. You bring it all the way down and it's actually on all four sides, and you can increase the distance a little bit. That's a great little tip to make it look as if you're looking straight down on your image. And so for all of these that I'm going to be doing with you today, I added a zero drop shadow around each of the photos before I added the custom drop shadow below. Now if we go back in here, we're going to talk about irregular drop shadows. The papers are not always bent uniformly, so this technique is to add drop shadows for things that aren't totally flat. And let's go back in here, and I've still got a spinning wheel. It's still processing, and I'm afraid to click on anything. Oh, there it goes, because it might close out my Photoshop Elements. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to put it below my original layer, my original photo layer. So I have a blank layer now below my photo layer. I'm going to hold down the Control key, click on the photo layer to get those marching ants around it, to make a selection of it. I'm going to hit D on my keyboard to make my background and my foreground colors black and white. Then I can do it several ways. I can just use the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to fill that in. You can see over here in the layers palette that it filled it in, and now I can press Control D for deselect. So I have just a black shape, the same shape as my photo layer. Next I'm going to get the Smudge Tool, which is right here with the Sharpen and the Blur tool. If you right click, you can find those three tools together. And I have a brush which is at its default size, and I'm going to use my bracket keys to make it larger or smaller. Now this is totally where the play comes into these custom drop shadows. You can make it as big or as small as you want for the purposes that you're going for. If you want to make a shadow that comes all the way down here in the middle, you're going to want a very large brush. But if you want it to look like the paper is kind of bumped all along the edge, you're going to want a smaller brush. And for this purpose right now, I'm just going to use a smaller brush. And I'm making sure that I'm on the shadow layer, and I'm just going to simply hold down and pull that out. Now you can see I've kind of pulled it out a little too far maybe. So if you want, you can back that out. I'm kind of starting with, you can see where the circle is a little bit below the edge of the paper, just so it's just slightly on the other side. And let's say I wanted to put another little bump in the paper here, maybe it's crinkled up there. Okay, and you can just do that to any edges and just bump it out just a little bit, and if it's too far in any places, you can bump it in, maybe change the size of your brush and just play with it until you get it. You can see it's already sort of looking like the paper has been pulled away. Now with the drop shadows, these drop shadows, let's see what words I used in here. Are not all one shade, but they're feathered, and they come out in a feathered way from the edges. And so what I'm going to do next is to add a Gaussian blur. Now you could add this Gaussian blur before you start smudging or after you start smudging. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to go to the filter drop down menu and then blur and Gaussian blur, and you just look out here at the effects that happen you can see what works best for your particular image, and it's going to vary also depending on whether you have white or a colored background. But you can see the difference there. What's great about this layer is if you have a larger Gaussian blur and you don't like the way it's showing on these edges, just grab it and make it smaller. You can even use your arrow keys to nudge things out. Now, if you want, you can go back and get that smudge tool and work with it a little bit more. See, I moved that shadow way too much. And so a lot of this is just simply playing with it. Now, I noticed in my tutorial that I left this out of the written tutorial, unless it's covered later on, which we may get to it. But what I often do then with the shadow layer is put this on the multiply blending mode. And you can see I tested on white paper and I tested on this paper here. And so you can really change the way it looks like. I'm trying to get this corner to just pop off. I'm making way too large of adjustments. Let's bring it back in. See, that looks much better there. And if you need to, you can also adjust the opacity of that till the shadow looks better. And now you can see here on this corner that this corner is sort of jumping right off the page. So it does just take some little playing until you get it quite right. And the best way to learn is to just practice. Now we're going to make a highlight on the page, and I actually need to go ahead and go back to my smudge tool and to make this work, smudge out this area more. To make it go along with the tutorial. Okay, to make a highlight on the photo, we're going to use the gradient tool. Now, so when you have crinkled up something, let's say your photo is bent a little bit, maybe it's been sitting in a shoebox for a while, you've dug it out from, you know, the 1950s or something. So this really makes for a good tutorial for those really old photos that have been in shoeboxes to make them look more realistic. But anyway, it's also going, the bent area is also going to have a highlight on it where the light is hitting it because it is bent upward. And so you also have to think about what you're going to put on the layer above your photo as well as the layer below your photo. And so I'm going to make a new layer right above my photo layer. I'm going to control click to get those marching ants around my photo again. I did that on the photo layer. Control click on that thumbnail. I'm going to activate my gradient tool, and I'm going to choose the foreground to transparent. Now what's important is that your foreground color be set to white and that you choose the reflective gradient option up here at the top. Those are some important settings. So you want foreground to transparent, make sure your foreground color is white, and you want to choose this reflected gradient. And now it's as simple as putting your mouse down right in the middle and drawing to one of the edges. And it's going to make it a duplicate all the way to the other edge. So I drew to the right edge and it made a reflective gradient all the way to the left edge. And then you can lower the opacity until it works in there just right to look like it's bent. But in my case, I put the drop shadow off to the right. My paper, my shadow isn't coordinating with the highlight right now. And so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. Make a new layer. Let's press Control D. And then I'm going to use my rectangular marquee tool, and I'm going to draw a selection that is right over this where I have the heavier drop shadow. And then I'm going to apply the gradient, and I'm going to start right out in the middle of the selection and move to the edge. And you can see I even drew that line a little crooked, and so my gradient is a little crooked, but that actually worked out really well. And I'm going to go up here, lower the opacity of that just a little bit. If I want it, it's not really sticking off the paper on the top edge, so I can go in there with my eraser tool if I want, maybe lower the opacity on it, make my brush bigger, and kind of, let's lower that opacity a little bit more, lower way down there. Kind of take some of that glare off from the top area. That didn't actually work out too well. That's why you hit that undo button. And I can actually, there we go, take it off. So it's heavier down here at the end than it is up here at the top. And I can hit Control D, and there you can see, let's raise that opacity up just a little bit, how that is now becoming much more realistic with that drop shadow. And so that's how you make the highlights. There are lots of ways to make those highlights. Let's go ahead and make another new layer above our photo layer. And if I want to make it look like the edge is coming off more or less, I can actually go in and use my polygonal lasso tool and maybe make a different sort of selection. You just have to kind of play with it. And I'm going to run my gradient this way. Well, obviously, you don't want that off the edge of your photo, so that wasn't exactly a good choice. I can actually fix that real quickly. Let's see, layer, nope, select, inverse, there. Now I have it just in the corner there. And you can see it's pretty stark on that edge, and so that doesn't work very well. I'll go get that low opacity eraser and start in on it. You can also, rather than use the gradient like that, you can also just use brushes and paint in there with your brush tool. Whoops, I got some kind of flower brush going on there from the last time I used my brushes. Just get a soft brush and paint it in there. Of course, that is too stark. Let's lower the opacity on the brush, and you can just kind of paint it in there and work with it. You might want to go ahead and switch your foreground and background colors, and if this edge is bent down, it's going to be darker. You can see it kind of beginning to come to life a little bit more here. And I'm spending way too much time playing with this, but you can see it's kind of looking where it's got a little bit more of a bent area there in the corner. You just got to play with things until they look right. So let's go ahead and this one I think looked okay. And what is next? I forget what's next. changing the color of the custom drop shadow. Sometimes the shadow will take on the color of the element, or really the back side of the element. So if this back side of this paper had a different color to the back side of the paper, it would cast a different kind of shadow onto the what's behind it here. And so what I'm saying is this drop shadow layer isn't always the best to be black. Sometimes you might want to, let's see, I'm going to press Control U to bring up the hue and saturation box. Sometimes you may just want to make it lighter, to make it a gray, and you can see that alone is one way to make it look more realistic. So in addition to lowering the opacity, just changing it to a gray color, which is really actually more effective with your white backgrounds. You can see how cool that is shaping up already just by our playing. But if you want it to be a color of the paper, you can go and grab a color out of the paper, go into your color picker, and come down here and make it a darker color. And then you're going to want to hit this button here next to the word lock, and it's going to lock the transparency of that layer before you fill it. And so now when I go, I think I can just go to fill layer, and I got foreground color, and there it changed to the color of the foreground color, but it kept the transparency of that layer when it did so. In other words, when as that is fading out and becoming more transparent because of the Gaussian blur, it's maintaining that. If you would try to do it without that, it's just going to make it one hard line once again. You can see I got circles in there. You would want to probably use a lot lower opacity brush to get rid of all those circles that I got going on in there. Doesn't actually look too bad. So that is how you can also change the color to make it cast back down on the paper the same color as similar to your background paper. So we're going to go see what we had reviewed, ways to make your drop shadow very irregular, like you've crinkled it up with a thumb there on the side of the photo. But sometimes photos have a balanced bend to them. Often you just think about those really old photos that you've pulled out, and they've kind of evenly bent straight over the middle. And so that's what we're going to utilize next in this next method of making custom drop shadows. And it describes here about having to turn it. I'm going to show you that in a minute, having to rotate it. But we're going to be utilizing the shear filter. And let's go ahead now, get rid of these, make another copy of this to play with. And now the shear filter only bends from right to left. And so if you want this photo to be bent either at the top or the bottom rather than the left or the right, we have to temporarily rotate the image. So I'm going to go to what is it, image, rotate, and I'm going to rotate it the layer 90 degrees to the left. Now I'm going to go to the Filter drop-down menu, Distort, and bring up that shear filter box. I'm going to just grab this line right here in the middle and pull it out. Now you can see in the preview here what happens. I don't really want it to be that drastic, and so I just want it to be just a little bit bent. I'm going to try that and click OK. Now you can see that it has actually bent that photo. Now I'm going to go to the image, rotate, and do the 90 degrees right to turn my photo back. So now I have an evenly bent photo, but now I've got to put that custom drop shadow on it, and you're going to see how easy and cool this is to do this real quickly. I'm going to hit Control and click on that thumbnail layer as we did before. We're following the same steps that we did in the irregular one, and I'm going to go ahead and leave this foreground color as this off deep green color, and I'm going to fill my new layer, which is my drop shadow layer. Now what I'm going to do is go up to the image drop down menu, and I'm going to flip, I think it is, I have to go back to my tutorial to look, but let's just try it, that layer vertically. Let's see if that's what I'm doing. Flip layer vertical. Ha! I'm doing really good. And because I'm guessing here. And actually I did this kind of backwards from the tutorial because now I've got this shadow up here at the top. So we're going to just put it at the top. And I'm going to go do the Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. And using the same settings that I had before, you can see automatically right away it has changed the drop shadow on this. I'm going to zoom out a little bit because it makes it more evident, and how quickly and easily that was. This is now bent up just on this edge here, and these two corners are bent up. If I don't want these corners to be bent up like that, I can go in here to my Smudge Tool and just kind of push them back in. I may have pushed it too much. It's taking a little bit to process. You may want to make little pushes, but just like that, the layer is very bent. You can add that highlight like we had before. This time I'm just going to put it down to about here for the selection. Oh, look, I gotta change my foreground and background color. And lower that opacity. Let's see, Control D to deselect, and see that didn't actually work out very well. You still got to go in with your very low opacity eraser and blend that in. I think that's looking pretty good there, but I'm going to test just something because, you know me, I like to play, and I'm actually going to put a feather on this selection, and let's see what happens. Let's just use a 50. This is not in my tutorial. This is stuff that just I come up with off the top of my head, and I'm going to make a feathered selection and then put that gradient in there. Let's see what happens. I was playing, wanted to see what happens if I went crooked. and hit Control D to deselect and lower that opacity, and you can see that actually worked really well, except for it goes outside. So I'm going to do layer and inverse there. That actually worked really well to use that feather when selecting the area to put your highlight on it. And so that's pretty cool. So that's another quick, easy way to make your photos look bent and to actually bend the photo itself to make it look realistic. Next, we're going to be doing some curled up corners. As I have stated before, I think I stated before, this is so much easier to do in the full version of Photoshop. We have to do some little tricks to get these same techniques to work in Photoshop Elements. It's a little bit harder to work it in Photoshop Elements, but it also helps you to learn more the various filters and tools within your program to get your creative spark going, to make you realize how these tools can be used in your layouts. So we're going to do the curled up corners now. And I'm going to go back to this layout, photo. Let's delete all this that we were playing with and get another copy of our original to play with. Okay, just as before, this time I'm going to hold down the Alt key and hit on this new, whoops, not Alt key, Control key. There we go. New layer icon, and it actually puts it directly below so I don't have to manually move the new layer below. And so Control click to get the marching ants and fill that in, and now I have that. You know, I was just thinking, you know what else you can do? Just there's always more than one way to do this. I could just simply hit Control J on my keyboard and then fill this layer, what would be edit, fill selection. I could actually do it even that way. So now we're going to turn up the corners, and you can do it the way that we were showing you in the very beginning, where you just kind of smudge out, imagine in your head where it might be lifted off the page, and that's where you're going to be putting the shadow. But sometimes in the full version of Photoshop, the capabilities allow you to make those corners a little bit more uniform, and that's what the purpose of this one is for. So I'm going to be on my drop shadow layer, go up to the filter drop down menu, distort, and this time I'm going to use pinch, and I'm going to put a pretty high pinch on it, about 30, and we'll click OK. And you can see in the icon here that it has pinched that layer, but you can't see it because it's being covered up with the photo. So the next thing you need to do is resize that so these come out. Now you don't want it to come out too far from the edge of the center of each side. You want it to be so that comes out about the same here and about the same here and about the same there, and then you can click OK. And so it's only coming out on the corners and not here in the middle of each of the edges. And let's go ahead and apply our Gaussian blur, just using, whoops, does help if you're on the right layer. Filter, blur, Gaussian blur, And there you can see already the edges are lifting off. And remember, using the multiply mode is always a great thing to do. Then reducing the opacity. And now we have all of the edges, all four of them, sort of lifting off. However, we can edit this and play with them a little bit more. What I'm going to do is in my rectangular marquee tool and just select, oh, we have it feathered. We don't want it feathered. Remember, we were playing with that. Okay, so I'm going to select this corner and Control J to put it on its own layer. Go back to my original layer, and I'm going to make one for one of these other corners. Control J, and I'm going to make one for this corner. Control J, and one for this bottom left corner. Now I can make this original one invisible, and I have the same thing only on 4 different layers. Now let's say, you know, we don't want all 4 corners to be sticking up, and so I'm going to just delete this one, and it actually, you see, looks a little bit more realistic. And remember that zero distance drop shadow always looks better with that added directly to the photo layer. You can see how much better that looks already because it gives this edge down here a little bit of a shadow that it needs. And so now we can work on each individual layer of the drop shadow, and I can hold down my control keys so that I can distort this and maybe move this to one direction or another to maybe have that lifting off the page in a little bit of a different manner. I think the opacity is too low on that, and so I'm going to raise that up. Then I might go to another one and adjust it. I'm just going to move this one so maybe this one is lifting off in that direction. Of course, I don't want this middle to be up off the edge. Now you can see it's really shaping up. This one I think is too far. There we go. And let's go do this one. I think I want, oh, it isn't that one, it's this one. I think I want this one to be about, you just kind of move it around until something hits and you go, aha! Now that corner looks like it's lifting off the page like I want it to. And remember, while I'm distorting this, I am holding down my control key to distort it. And so now I think I've got them all individually kind of looking the way I want. This one doesn't look quite right, so let's move it a little bit more. We'll move it in. Now you have to go back and create a new layer above and start adding those highlights. And as I showed you before, you can even do this just with your brush tool, and I have it on a very low opacity. And you have to imagine where the highlights might be hitting. And in this case, I think it's about right here. And this just takes a little bit of practice. And lower that opacity a little bit. You could even, I don't think the screen mode might help, but you can see already how that the highlights are making it even more realistic, and like the edges are lifting off the pages. And I've actually done this really fast, and I didn't do as great of a job as I did with my other samples. Hold down my control key. I'm thinking that is just not the right color for this drop shadow. Oh well, see, you just keep playing until you get something to where it looks like the photos are doing what you want them to do. And you know, on this layer over the photo, remember that you can go back in and with your brush, and also it's lifting off here. So I'm going to actually, on the back side of the let's take it back to normal. There we go. On the back side of where the highlight is, I'm going to add some where it's darker because it's going back down in. And that really helps to make these seem like they're lifting off the page. Okay, so that is not the best example. The example I had when I started out, you can see here it's the same thing. There are my 3 corners that I've done. Actually, I have it in black. I think that's the big difference. And then there are my highlights, and you can see I did it much better in this. And so I hope that you know, I have the corners actually highlighted. I wasn't doing that this last time. And then you can see I have the black lines here and the white lines here for my highlights. So anyway, I want to see what you can do with this. I have a layout. I think I have it already in the forum where I utilize these techniques. And I hope you've learned a whole lot with this tutorial, because I sure did when I first wrote it and first learned how to do this and first played and come up with all of these techniques. And it's just a lot of fun to really bring new depth to your layouts and really make them more realistic. So have fun and do share your results. Thanks for watching.